Well, welcome back to the Dungeon Master's Block, the place where we come to talk about the Dungeon Master, the most important person in the game, the only person capable of playing God, killing characters, and lowering the egos of all other people at the table. I'm one of your hosts, DM Mitch, and in this episode, I'm really excited to say we have returning guest Jim Zub is with us, and we will be discussing rebuilding Pantheons. We've already had an episode on building Pantheons. Now we're talking about rebuilding Pantheons with the idea that somewhere along the line of your homebrew world's history, there may come a time when new gods will emerge to replace the old. And so that's going to be the discussion for today. I'm really excited about it. But before we jump into the meat, I have a 5-star review to read to all of you. So sometimes as we are doing the show, we have missed a couple of reviews along the way. Apologies, I'm not always the best bookkeeper in that sense. So here's one that we missed, and this one is from Bartaloo Tanner, and it is entitled Excellent, 5 stars. As a fellow podcaster, I can tell how much joy and skill goes into the crafting of this show. As a fellow DM, I can tell how much knowledge and passion the hosts have for playing D&D. It's outstanding. Highly recommend. Thank you so much, Tanner. Super appreciate that review. Sorry that we missed it on our first go round, but we're giving you a shout out now. And with that, let's get into this week's meat. Let's start talking with Jim Zub about rebuilding some Pantheons.
I'm starving. We ain't had nothing but maggoty bread for 3 stinking days.
Why can't we have some meats?
Looks like meat's back on the menu, boys.
So today we have a returning guest, and I am very excited, even though it feels like it was an eternity ago. It was less than 2 years, but we're having back on Jim Zub. And if you don't know, how
Shame
dare
on
you?
you.
But he is the writer of Conan, Pathfinder, countless D&D things, in D&D and things, including Rick and Morty and D&D, things and D&D. And one of my absolute favorite things that he's ever done that I read with the kids, that you even signed to my own children, is the Young Adventurer's Guides. I'm actually having my 7-year-old use it for reading comprehension. Certainly some words I don't know if I should have let her read, and definitely harder ones than she.
What is a corpse? You're like, oh, geez, here we go. Nice.
But
thanks
Jim,
for having me back.
Oh,
it's
yeah.
a pleasure to be back.
Welcome
Nice.
back. Yeah, we're excited. We're
thanks,
always
man.
excited for guests, but we are very excited that you were willing to carve out some time and join us back on the show. So, like, if any of our listeners haven't, maybe they didn't listen to the first episode that you were on, which go back and listen to that. But maybe you want to give us some more information, but can you just tell us a little bit about yourself, whether that's what it is, a little bit more of what you do for a living, who you are, whatever you would like to fill in. It's up to you.
So I'm a Canadian writer, primarily known for my comic book stuff. So I've been doing work in comics, depending on how you measure it. Like I did my first web comic 20 years ago, but for most people, like the last 10 to 12 years has been kind of my primary output. I did my own kind of creator-owned series called Skull Kickers, which was kind of my D&D meets Conan meets a buddy cop movie sort of comedy action, and that got me on the radar for some people, which would turn into actually writing the official Pathfinder comic, the D&D comic series. I've been writing this series of miniseries since 5th edition launched in 2014, which got me directly in contact with Wizards, and we've built up an amazing relationship. So I've done a lot of consulting over there and a lot of front-facing kind of writing, where I did development on Descent into Avernus. I put together this series called the Young Adventurer's Guides, which is meant to bring new players into the hobby. And a lot of these crossover series, like you were mentioning before, the Rick and Morty versus D&D, the first one I co-wrote with Pat Rothfuss, and the second one I wrote solo. And then I also helped develop the game box set that they released soon after that. And the D&D and Stranger Things miniseries, where we kind of showed the game elements that were happening off camera in the Stranger Things, series as we've been going through the seasons, and digging in. The kids play D&D during a very similar period to when I started playing D&D. So that's just like a huge nostalgia wave for me, where I was able to go through and kind of go back and dig deep into my collection and bring forth some of my favorite memories and kind of transpose it into the Stranger Things universe, which has been a ton of fun. I love bringing new people into play role-playing games. They have transformed my life, and I would not be a writer today without the power of tabletop. So, it's always happy to bring new people in the door, always happy to reinvigorate people's, love for the games and talk story and talk dungeon mastering and all that kind of stuff.
There's some like autobiographical elements in the Stranger Things series that you worked on. That's fantastic.
Yeah, it's just, that's the thing, is that when I was going back through and realizing, because when you're playing so much D&D, and I played every single edition, you just assume, like, your brain kind of melds a bunch of it together. And going back and rereading some of those old books, like the Bessem stuff, that Basic Expert, and Companion, all that, like, I had forgotten certain little rules or certain elements of it, and I wanted to make sure we were accurate whenever the kids were playing the game, that it was the real deal. And I was like, oh yeah, that's right, initiative wasn't a D20. Oh right, everything from weapon speeds to all these other little elements that come up during the game. And it's like I remembered them as soon as I read it.
Yeah,
but it
unlocking
was like
that key to where those memories
are
stored.
And there's the obvious ones, like THAC0 never goes away because it's such an intrinsic sort of terminology, but it's the little details and things like that. In some of the older books, they didn't measure weight in pounds or ounces or anything. They measured it in coins. So it's like, because that's all that was the most important thing, was how much treasure you could gather, right? So if I have to toss this broadsword, how many coins am I replacing for it? Like, it's stuff like that was really kind of fun to be able to remember and infuse into the stories where possible, right? So
it's awesome. So our second question, as always, and we definitely, I know your work well enough that we have to put the caveat, unfortunately, for you. Is there anything that you're working on currently that you can talk about?
Yeah, there's always a set of projects that are in development that are behind the NDA stuff, but of stuff that's been announced. I'm the current writer of Conan the Barbarian at Marvel. We've got a big anniversary issue coming up in September. So the way they do the numbering on the current comics is they have the current numbering, and then they have what they call legacy numbering. So if you did all the previous series combined, so the current issue number, coming up is issue 25 of the current series. But when Marvel originally lost the license to Conan, the last issue was 275. So if you put those two series together, we're at Legacy 300. I finally get to write one of these big honking anniversary issues. I'm super, super pumped and really, really proud to be a part of it. So that's a big one for me. I'm doing this other series at Marvel called Avengers Tech-On, which is a really fun team up between Marvel Comics and Bandai of Japan. And so it's almost like Power Rangers meets the Avengers. So it's like big, over-the-top Sentai style colorful action and adventure with the Avengers. So the Avengers lose their superpowers. So Iron Man is now, his armors are the most potent way for everyone to kind of keep superheroing. So he makes armors for everyone on the team. And now they're like these super powered cybernetic Avengers. Like it's wild stuff. And it's been a lot of fun to put together. I've got a new Dungeons and Dragons miniseries that's been announced called Mindbreaker. And it's a bit of a kind of a soft lead into Baldur's Gate 3, the video game. So some of the plot elements that you can already partake of in the early access version of Baldur's Gate 3 that's in development from Larian, we're kind of foreshadowing some of those evils and forces in the Baldur's Gate comics that I've been doing since 2014. It's been a ton of fun to put together, and our crew is fantastic. And then last but not least, I guess there's two other things. Geez, I've got, I'm one of the co-writers of the World of Darkness comic series that's coming out through Vault.
Oh, nice.
So it's vampires versus werewolves. Love the White Wolf stuff and was really hooked on that when it first came out in the 90s. and getting to dig back into that has been an absolute joy. And we haven't announced the title yet, but I can say that there are more Young Adventurers guides in development.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
I'm on board. Whatever it is. I don't need to know the title.
Yeah.
Where can I buy
No,
it?
we were slowed down on because of the pandemic stuff, but they have been bubbling away quietly, in the background, and I'm excited for those to get announced. So yeah.
Fantastic. So much good stuff.
Other than that, nothing. Pretty bored, Yeah.
You got nothing going on. So
yeah, just pretty.
Man, what a
pretty
waste
chill,
of a question.
Right? No, it's all good.
and as always, we have a surprise question for you, Jim. We have one from our Patreon Dragon, DM Eric. DM Eric asks, what was the most fun or memorable boss fight you've ever had at a tabletop role-playing game?
Oh man, so that's a good question. Probably maybe not the most. Yeah, one of the most memorable. Really amazing. We were playing in a Ravenloft campaign, and this was the 90s Ravenloft, the whole campaign setting with the Domain of Dread and all that kind of stuff. And there was an adventure where there was like some necromancer, and he was like raising these armies of the dead. And we had been fighting waves and waves of them or whatever, and we don't know why it's happening. And then finally everything calms down, and this necromancer, stands up from behind a huge gravestone, and he's about to monologue. Like, it's so obvious he's about to monologue. And one of the members of our party goes, "No, I'm just going to fire an arrow at him," and rolls the natural 20 and hits him right between the eyes with the arrow. So we just imagined, like, the DM went with it and just said, this guy gets up in this big flourish of dark smoke or whatever, and he goes, "And now you see," thunk, and then he just goes, "Oh," and he drops back behind the gravestone. And because he was a regular human guy, we killed him outright. And because we were supposed to get attacked immediately, so then the ghouls and all the ghasts and the zombies rush us, but we never found out why the villain did any of the things he did, or what the purpose was, or any of the big deciding stuff, because we'd notched this guy right in the face. So we couldn't stop laughing. It was just so hilarious and so ridiculous, and we saved the town and everyone else, but we literally never understood the villain's motivation because we didn't give him a chance to monologue at us.
That's
so.
great. I can just imagine your DM like crumpling up the 3-page speech and
Ah,
throwing it over his shoulder.
Over the
Just like,
shoulder.
all right, player agency, let's do this.
Yeah, there we go. Nice job, everybody. So I don't you want the DM to have their moment, but we were laughing so hard at that. Everyone's entertainment is kind of the watchword of a good game.
Yep.
So if we're all having a great time, it's like, why not? Whatever.
Well, and that's
what's coming next. It's a big fight. Yeah.
That's great that the DM just kind of rolled with the punches and was just like, all right, cool. This is a great moment in itself.
Yeah.
Let's go.
Let's just roll. Yeah.
Well,
good fun.
Well, thanks, Jim, for that answer, and thank you, Eric, for that question as well.
Which I will attempt to be a professional at this and use that as a segue, because you never know when your players will just ruin everything that you had planned. And so we can leverage that idea as the topic. And you heard it in our intro. And if you looking at your podcatcher, you read that we're going to talk about potentially rebuilding your Pantheon, because there are certainly scenarios where you, the DM, decide it, where your players have decided that that's what's going to happen. And it could be for story, it could be for world building, whatever you need it for. And what we haven't mentioned as one of the things that you were the writer on, or at least a writer on, is Wayward, a series that I absolutely loved. 30 issues. So it's not, you don't commit your whole life to it, but a nice portion. And that is certainly the catalyst for this conversation.
Cool.
So I absolutely loved Wayward, and I started rereading it again, just to prep a little bit for this.
Awesome. Yeah. The concept behind Wayward is basically these Japanese, so yokai, which in Japanese terminology kind of encompass like ghosts and monsters and the supernatural kind of isms as a whole. The creatures of old are kind of losing their grip on the world, and a new generation of the supernatural is finding its footing in Wayward, represented through these kind of teen characters. So we joked around when the series launched that it was like Buffy meets Japan, but it's like, it is in some ways. We had these supernatural kind of hunters and all this kind of stuff, and these kids realizing that they were coming into their own powers. And as you get further on, you realize that they are connected to this broader supernatural change that the concept of generational divide and the old must give way to the new is happening on this much higher level. And in some ways, I guess that's a pretty good piece of advice to start off on, is that you have to make sure that whatever you're doing as a dungeon master, as cool and as epic a battle or transition or whatever your special effects narrative budget is going to be in terms of the tabletop game, that your players feel like they are a part of it, that it's not just NPCs shuffling the cards in the heavens. Do you know what I mean? That doesn't mean that the players are going to get to make all the decisions, or that they're going to be at the, at every single point, but that there's a sense of their involvement, that they know that they're a part of that story, instead of it just being, I think some dungeon masters want to be, how do I put it? They want to tell something really memorable, but it ends up putting the story on rails, where you're just like, okay, this is happening, good luck, and you guys are gonna have to deal with my monologues, getting back to our kind of earlier example, right? That's right. The gods are going to do all these things and you're powerless to be involved. And it's like, obviously, if you're lower level characters, you're not going to necessarily you're not equal to the gods. You're not able to push all the levers, but there should be some element of it that they feel like they can get a handle on, or that they are a part of, and helping or understanding or motivating, so that it doesn't feel like NPC theater. You know what I mean? Where the players are the audience for the bigger story being told, right? So that was something really important to me when we were doing Wayward, was that, Rory and Ayane and all the rest of the characters, they have their own personal motivations that are clashing with these bigger changing forces. And so we care about them, and we end up caring about the bigger things that are moving in the background, because they tie into each other, and there's emotional qualities that matter to each other. So that's probably my first, piece of advice. You're not, as much as I'm a writer, but you're not writing a novel. You're writing, you are playing a game with your friends. And so make sure that you're not just monologuing at them the whole kit and caboodle, right? So
absolutely.
Yeah.
There's some great pieces of advice there, in the idea of, like, I don't think I've ever looked at it this way until you were done talking. But the idea that you as the DM aren't bringing a finished product to the table.
Right.
There's something amazing to be said about the idea of, like, a rough draft, a first draft, and certainly the other players.
The seed of an idea. Yeah. I mean, it's one of the problems with the pre-published modules. As much as I love them, and I'm a collector and I love having those, one of the things you have to get away from is that it's going to play out in those text boxes, and that it's all going to go to that final finishing point. If we get there naturally, that's cool. And if I can massage things into a direction that it feels natural, that's great. But you have to be willing to change your mind, and you have to be willing to tilt into, where the players are discovering and what they're excited about. Otherwise, it's not going to be a satisfying experience, and it's one of the big differences about role-playing games versus, prose or any other kind of writing, where it doesn't work unless we're all doing it. We all got to have skin in the game, and we have to feel like what we do matters, Yeah.
As we go through this topic, Jim, I think our listeners would love to hear what inspired you in that story. But this idea of rebuilding a pantheon, I think, needs like a catalyst,
exactly,
like a reason. Lore-wise, story-wise, like, what is the purpose that new gods emerge and take the place of old gods for DMs listening? Like, there should be a reason that's happening, right? Like, are the old gods dead or dying, or were they killed or fading away?
Is this some natural cycle, or is this an artificial thing that is triggered it, right?
Yeah. So what are the reasons in, like, a homebrew world that this event could take place?
I know the classic option is some sort of prophecy. I try and avoid those things in my own narratives, because the minute you try and staple things to a prophecy, first of all, players, that's the first thing they'll destroy. if you tell them something has to go way, X, they're going to go Y every time. Like, if you say, oh, and therefore this this creature must die, they go, well, what if we save it? Like,
Yeah.
that's just, classic player,
I
behavior,
love prophecies, but I think if you're going to use prophecies in a role-playing game, because of what you're talking about, like player agency, and not, you need to be more, really wiggly with
Abstract.
the prophecy.
Well, you have to be
Abstract,
abstract.
yes.
Yeah.
Like your
That's
player
where you say
sees
stuff.
a crow flying down from the sun, like
Exactly.
visionish, so that
Or
as you go
poetic.
on,
Exactly.
the meaning of, poetic, you can change that meaning as you go.
Exactly.
And what you'll find, I think, if you do that, is your players will find those meetings, and you will go, "Ooh, that's a good."
That is the DM trick.
Yeah.
Right?
Oh,
the
yeah.
DM trick.
Yeah.
If you haven't, you must have talked about this before in advice. The DM trick is always to set up the big pieces or to plant those seeds and to have some ideas for where it can go. But if the players come up with a better idea or something that they feel like, the number of times that my players have gone, oh, I see what you're doing.
Yeah.
And then they'll tell me some incredible confluence of activity. Like, this old adventure actually ties into this new adventure. And I'm like, oh crap, that's better than what I got.
Yep.
and then you just lean back and you stroke the chin and you go, well, I'm glad you're paying attention. And they're like, whoa.
Don't be afraid to lean into that.
Yeah. There's nothing wrong with that. And so prophecy is one of those areas where you could say, and whatever,
you're right. You figured out that's exactly what the venomous snake meant.
Exactly.
Well done.
The day shall never rise means whatever, or, the waters, whatever kind of thing like that. And then they see it and they attach to it. And you're like, that's going with the momentum. So let's roll with it. That's the fun part of the whole thing. But in terms of the gods themselves, what I think is important is that what the players are seeing one small slice of a story, right? And it's the slice that's important to them because it's rooted in their needs and their motivations. But that doesn't mean you don't think about what the broader structures are. I think that's one of the things that you want to do to make a world feel full, that if they go into the town and everything's the same every time they go there, they're like, well, this has been built for me. It's the shop front for me to buy and sell my crap. And therefore it has no meaning. But if every time they go, things are subtly changing, or buildings are being torn down, or things are being built, or, people change and grow and move on, or whatever is happening. I think the same kind of thing with the gods, where you're like, okay, our cleric knows one little tiny slice of this broader thing that's happening, but these other gods have their own motivations and they're using each other or trying to hold on while the entire pantheon is crumbling beneath them, or be reborn, or something like that. I think those are fun kind of elements to be slowly, revealed, that you can peel back the onion and they go, oh, I get what's going on. The gods are dying. And you go, okay, one element of this, the gods are dying, but do you know which gods are going to try and get out of this, or which ones knew it was coming and planned for it, or which ones are going to, try and reincarnate themselves, or steal, some great power, or stop it from happening. And if you know those kinds of bits and pieces, it can just tee up all kinds of other cool story elements. And so the intrinsic basic concept of, huge epic things suddenly can involve a much smaller cast or a more emotional element. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. Right. And those are the kinds of things that I think are really fun to be able to play with, because one of the problems with the cosmic level events, the stars are erupting and cosmic dragons are eating planets, and you're like, I fight kobolds. You're like, what? Why do I care? Like, what does this mean to me? Do you know what I mean? I think sometimes people want to spend the infinite, special effects budget, and they're like, and the ground shall burn asunder. And you're like, cool. Can we do anything to stop this? Or are we just like waiting for you to finish describing all the terrible, or whatever? And it's like, okay, but this one thing, or this one path, or there is something fascinating. And when you see something like, the classic Dragonlance, right? So I think of Goldmoon bringing healing back to the clerics of the world, or something like that. And you're like, oh, that's cool. There's something now that cast has that no one else has, or there's some element that they bring to this on a personal level that now I feel rooted in the concept, rather than it just being like huge, massive, soul-turning stuff. So you're bringing it back to way where, these teen kids are still teenagers, going through all the growing pains and fears and neuroses of those crucial years of their lives. And also they are tied up in this supernatural, transference that is underway, but we care about it because we care about them. Right. And so that's where it can be helpful to, instead of just presenting the big idea to your players, to sort of even plant that seed early, maybe even a session 0 or during character creation, just say like big changes are coming, or, letting your cast know, hey, there's stuff going on. Not that I want to pre-script any of it, but I just want them to be open to the idea. It's again, one of those things where communication is so valuable. Sometimes I'll see people, they'll start a D&D campaign and they'll just be like, make whatever you want. And you're like, well, you're going to get a grab bag of randomness. Mm-hmm. And there's something fun and kooky about that. But if you tell people we're running Curse of Strahd, they're going to make characters that are more focused on the undead and, cool stuff in and around those elements, rather than it just being like grab bag, good luck, and hope that you're going to get a narrative that works for you. Right. So yeah, if you say to them, there's big movement with the gods, then you're probably going to get more characters that are faithful or attached to the pantheons or involved with their faith. And now you've instantly got those pieces, the strings you can pull on. Yeah.
I think too, with talking about like catalyst, like, for me as a DM who's created my own world, one thing that I've recognized is like I've come across these cool ideas from other stories, and then I go, ooh, that's sweet, let me put that into my world somehow, and that is great, and all of us as DMs and world builders do that. But then the negative side that I've realized is sometimes I've grabbed onto ideas, and so has every single other person. Right. Like, for instance, we're talking about like gods dying and needing replacement. My world has a God's War, and so does almost every other DM out there. So like I now have to, as a DM and a world builder, go, how do I make mine unique? But I think like with this idea of replacing old gods, I think our minds would, the first thing our mind goes to is the death of the old gods, right? But like it doesn't need to be the death. But instead, what if, Jim, you were talking about like returning to a place and seeing that the world is changing. If you kind of talk about that on a macro level, as you go through your world building and role playing and running different campaigns with your players, your home group, they may see the world change. You might start to have the introduction of technology and different weapons and different things that the world works. And maybe the old gods just reach this point where they look at the world of mortal kind and go, this is not the world that we came to.
Right.
And maybe
or the
they
god
just
of
leave.
war says, this isn't war the way I recognize it. Or, these armies and these things are not, what they once were.
Yeah.
I'm going to give up the mantle. And then you could have this fascinating race. Well, who becomes the new god of war, becomes the new, whatever, or what may have you. Or you could have a god kind of break, shatter, and it becomes a lot more of a fine, what used to be an all-encompassing kind of role of a god gets split into a series of smaller ones, right? So no longer the god of war. Now there's a god of weaponry, and there's a god of martial arts, and there's a god of, like all these finer points of the god.
Yeah.
And and they're not all going to get along, and they're all going to have different sort of points of view. And some of them are going to be honorable or dishonorable.
That's an interesting concept. Almost like this council.
I would say war
this
council.
Group. Yeah. That
but you
takes
so you take
all that
where
power.
there used to be 10 gods, now there's going to be 40. And it's like the complexity suddenly increases, right?
Yeah.
Or one of the gods gets split asunder, and now all the other gods look at each other and go, we can do that? Oh, but if I break the other gods, I'll be still the big one and you'll all be the small ones. Let's have at it. You know what I mean? And there's something quite fascinating about that, where you get your god war, but the end result isn't just we're going to fight. The end result is one god will stay the most powerful, and the other ones will have to be these sort of, pieces of the broader whole. Maybe, you know, there's all kinds of different ways you could approach it, right? Or a god realizes that if they stay around for this apocalyptic event, they will be destroyed, so they vanish from the world for a time, and people think, oh, that's the first god that died. You're like, no, that's the one that's hiding out waiting for all the rest to die. Do you know what I mean? Or something like that. So there's all kinds of ways you could do a good turn on it, where you set up one expectation, and then as more knowledge comes out, you actually realize something, you know, greater is going on, right? So,
well, I think back to Wayward and the way that the yokai are connected to these changes that are happening in the world. The first thing that I think of is in D&D, goblins being connected to Maglubiot, or how gnolls are connected, or how Sahuagin are connected, or like thinking like those could be the first signs. And then the other thing I think is, you as the DM really need to kind of decide when this happens, do you want your story to be proactive or reactive? Because if it's like, well, okay, here are the signs, this happens every I looked at my watch, which is not helpful in an audio medium, but but the idea that it happens every 100 years,
sure.
And so now people are getting ready, or it's never happened before, and people are reacting to these
exactly
happening.
And you know, most of this stuff, most campaigns are, your players are reactive at the start because they don't know what's going on, and then once they understand some piece of it, or they enable some bit of knowledge or some item, now they have hopefully a proactive quality they can choose, or they can make something happen. Whether or not they realize the full extent of it, they at least have their own goal. Oh, if we take this item over here, we might be able to save the god of healing, or we might be able to, you know, stop this thing from happening. And maybe they don't, or maybe they decide not to, you know, or characters decide having gods in this world is a bad thing, and let's bring it all down, you know, down with the man, like whatever that, you know, kind of element this takes on. I think that there's some really fascinating bits in that. I don't know if you guys ever played the original Planescape setting. So good. One of the things they introduced was this idea of factions. And so in addition to your character class and your race and all that stuff, you would join this, you know, faction out amongst the planes. And each of them have very different views of reality. And some of them, you know, believe in order, and some of them believe in chaos, and some of them believe in have a good time till the end, and all of this kind of stuff, and everything in between. And so, you know, your party could end up taking on an interesting sort of cast where they decide, we're in for this or we're not, or we're going to help this along, or we're going to try and slam the brakes on it, you know? And again, you have to be kind of reactive to that, because in your head, you might have been like, oh, my party will become favorite of the new gods. And then you're like, no, they don't want any gods at all. And you're like, oh, okay, that's an angle. What are, you know, how do we enable them to feel empowered and engaged with that kind of a story? And how do one of the things we do in storytelling is you have themes in your stories, right? So the idea of Wayward, you know, is this idea of generational divide, and that the old gives way to the new, and that no one who's in a position of power wants to give it up, and no one wants to leave the party, right, for the most part. And the people that are stepping into these positions of power don't necessarily know what they're getting into, right? And we exaggerate that with the teenagers and all these other elements, but that's really what's at the heart of a lot of the big movements and themes of the story. But a story doesn't function unless you test the theory. So you know, the classic example of whatever, Spider-Man, great power with great power comes great responsibility. Well, how do we know this? We know this because in Spider-Man's origin, Uncle Ben dies because Peter Parker is not responsible, and therefore he learns a very valuable lesson. So make sure, if you think there's a big theme that's forming, that you test that you test your players. If they say the gods must be destroyed because they've been manipulating humanity and mortal kind too long, test them on that. Make them prove that that's the right way to go, or maybe change their mind, right? Are gods all bad? No, maybe gods are good. Oh, maybe I'm not so sure anymore. And you want to push them, and you want to push those. If they have the exact same point of view at the start of the story and the exact same point of view at the end of the story, that's fine, but there has to still, they have to be tested and come out the other side and go, now I know why. I know why I felt this way at the start, and now I know why I felt that way at the end. But usually there's some sort of evolution, or there's some sort of sacrifice or change that's going to happen to their attitude. And you as the DM need to be able to enable, or first of all, see those things forming, and then find ways to test it, you know? So if the cleric is like, I believe in my God no matter what, and we have to save them from this coming God apocalypse or whatever we're calling it, you know, test that, show ways that their God has manipulated and made terrible choices and hurt people or curse things, and make them, if they decide to redouble their efforts, that's a choice they're making, that it's not an easy choice, that they're not just going, well, I'm a cleric, so I'm all in for, you know, my God every time. And you're like, okay, even if they're like this, even if they're like this, even if they did that, yeah, okay, even if they're like that, even if, you know, and you just push, and you don't say it to them that way, but you just prove it through these scenes, right? And then if they've made those choices, now the rest of the cast is like, I can't believe you're still deep in the paint for God pants. Like, what are you doing here? You know, forcing that tension, forcing that drama. And that if they make that choice, now there's cool story potential and drama built around it. You know?
Well, this is such an interesting concept, this idea that we're talking about of this new pantheon, because when you build a homebrew world and you start working on your pantheon, that is not something that your players have agency on and have direct. You're creating these gods for your players to, if they choose a cleric, or whether or not a cleric or not, they choose that they want to worship a type of god. But this whole idea of the old gods passing on or dying or whatever it is, needing to be replaced somehow, like this is 100% the time that you lean in to that player agency and give them that. You create these gods together, whether they are themselves becoming the gods themselves.
Right. That's the plot. So there's a video game called Divinity 2, and that is the plot of that, is that you find out that the players have the potential to replace, you know, the gods, and the players can now compete with each other, or they can sort of look and go, no, it should be you. Like, of all of us, you're the one who's got the best chance of making it to the finish line. And again, that's an interesting plot line where you're like, well, what's on the line? Are you going to be a good god? You know, like, if we can even pull this off, is this going to be for the benefit of all, right? And then you throw in age-old biases and you know, racial tensions and like all those other things, and it gets really quite interesting, right? Like, it's this sort of thing of saying, okay, is this a time for another race to step to the top of the heap? Is this a time for, you know, your classic Tolkien, the elves passing into, you know, the West or whatever? Like, is this the time for one race to fade out, or for this pantheon to step away, and therefore this civilization that we think of as the most powerful in this world will also fade into, you know, obsolescence or whatever? Like, that's some interesting stuff.
Or
right?
even it, like, is there a race in your world, a type of people that are throughout history, like, they don't have gods. They don't know what the origin was, but they don't accredit their origin to gods. But now you have new gods coming into place. And what if one of those, throw out whatever, Loxodons in your world don't have gods. One of your players is a Loxodon, and now has been given this chance to become a deity themselves.
Right. And what does that mean, right? You know, one of the things that we sort of talked about when we were developing Wayward was, what is a modern god in terms of what is the priority of our society, right? So this one character, Nikaido, he's basically like, you know, connected, the connectivity of technology and all that stuff that didn't exist, you know, in the old world. Well, he represents a new force in this kind of, you know, universe, and something intrinsic to the way that we interact with each other, right? So you could potentially have, you know, gods of different things than there have been in the past, right? Or what may have you, you know, gods of concepts rather than gods of races, right? So maybe your pantheon starts with, okay, there's a mortal god, and there's an elf god, and there's a dwarf god, but you're going to give way to conceptual gods of war and of healing and of, you know, those kinds of things. That could be quite interesting as well, and loyalties rise and fall in and around that sort of stuff. Right?
I'm going to say something that I feel like is kind of controversial to say in the like role playing sense. We kind of shy away from this idea of that there's a wrong way to do something, right? In role playing. But
Right.
I want to say that if we're talking about like old gods and new gods, I think there is a wrong way to do this. And we're not talking about old gods and same gods. Like, if you're going to make this shift where you're saying, "Oh, we're raising up new gods," but then the god of death is the exact same as the old god of death, same motivations, and it works the same too. Like I'm my head is like swirling with what you were talking about, Jim. With like, what if the god of war all of a sudden has 5 gods of war that have their different aspects?
Exactly.
What if it's 40? Like,
yeah, you need to make it feel like there's evolution. There has to be, if the old god of death is something to be feared, maybe the new god of death is one of rebirth. And so people embrace this idea of change and ending their lives at the right time. You know what I mean? Like, how can you put a spin on some of these concepts?
Law and chaos and make them and all this kind of stuff. Yeah.
All those different sorts of elements that gods could literally shift in terms of what we think of as good or evil. That we assume that a god of war is something, more intrinsically evil. How can you frame that in a way that is not? And that, off the top of my head, that's a tough one, but it's like, okay, let's play these different elements against each other, or, honorable combat versus, wholesale slaughter, and that these become 2 separate concepts that split forth from each other, or what may have you.
You don't want to just give the players new names that they have to remember. You need it to be a change.
Yeah. It's not just like throwing it all into a hat. And I think that it's also something where, like I said, trying to make it feel personal, as hard as that can be. One of the ways you can do that, even if it's not like one of my players is going to become a god, or one of my players is going to be directly contacted by a god constantly, but there are ways to echo themes, right? So if one of your core players is trying to find whatever justice, or find themselves, or some intrinsic part of their story, you can reflect that on a higher level, where suddenly a god's quest is very similar thematically to what they understand, right? If they're looking for revenge, then a god is like, look, if I'm passing off into, obsolescence, the last thing I want is vengeance. And, the player goes, oh, I get that. Yeah, okay. I'm in for you. I'll help you do this thing if you help me with mine, because we have the same goal. See, it's vengeance, or whatever that might be, right? And so there's ways to make these huge cosmic shifts feel personal, or there's ways to the symbols can feel very similar, high and low, as you're working through these concepts, right, emotionally, which I think is better than just, okay, pull out the Tarrasque, or pull out the biggest thing you can imagine, and narratively describe continents crashing, and tidal waves destroying cities. You're like, that's all fine in terms of big, broad, prophetic, cool visuals, but do I care about the people being washed away in the flood? Do I care? Like, is that the hometown of one of my characters? Is that the kingdom that the paladin has sworn their loyalty to? Now I want this to be, I want to be at the center of this, right? That's where it's really, you always got to bring it back to the cast and the personal. Otherwise, you're just smashing the toys together.
Well, I almost see those scenes happening in the campaign you're playing as the results of maybe your players who are perhaps becoming gods, making mistakes along the way, and seeing now with godlike responsibility when they do not do the correct quote unquote thing, what can possibly happen.
Right. Or once you've leveled up to a certain point, there could be a discussion of, well, you're not allowed to have, as much as a god wants to be worshipped and all these kinds of things, you have to be above the petty conflicts, because when you're not, the other gods will punish you, because it's so easy to punish you if you're still emotionally attached to this city. All I have to do is torture those people, and you're like, oh yeah, you kind of got me bent over a barrel here. And it's like, well, you're a god now. You shouldn't be worried about, the death of 1,000 people.
Yeah.
And you're like, but when I was immortal, I did. You're like, I got to give that up. Like, or do you? Or, and again, it's those kinds of test the theme, test the dedication. Players wanting to be deific and powerful is a very common kind of thing, but you got to make them question whether or not this is the right path, or if this is the choice they really, really want to make, because look at all the damage that's going to be done for their, for their quest for power, right?
Yeah, it just paints the picture of such great role-playing moments, and seeing how different players react to it. I almost envision like an argument between two PCs, where one is yelling like, "You've lost your whole sense of humanity," and the other one going, "Yes, yes, I have."
Exactly. So I'll give you an example. It's on a much smaller scale, but I think it ties into what we're talking about here. So I had two players of mine many years ago. They really wanted to play evil characters, your classic, I want to be the bad guy. And I fought against it for many different adventures. And then we started a new campaign, and I was like, fine. Here's the rules. There's only two players. I said, you two can be totally evil, chaotic evil, whatever you want. But you have to be loyal to each other, because I don't want in-party fighting. There's only two players, for crying out loud. And, you have to tell me what your kind of end goal is with this. And they were like, oh, we're going to bring our dark deity to the world. And I was like, great. Okay, fine. So the best part is that they were pretending to be good adventurers, but they were always doing terrible things, like behind the scenes. And at first I let them do it, and they were like, oh, we're so bad, and oh, this is so great. 3 or 4 sessions in, there's now a small group of NPCs that thinks they're good people, that trust them, that likes them,
and they like them,
and says all the right things, and says like, oh, you guys, my life was lost, and now I see how, great things can be. And the players are looking at each other. It's excruciating because it's like twisting the thumbscrews. They're like, I kind of like so-and-so, you know what I mean? But they know they're going to sacrifice them for this greater evil, and making the players sweat their decision that they thought they could just backstab anyone and mistreat anyone because they're NPCs, because they're abstract. But the minute I made it personal, the minute I made, no, that NPC is cool. And it's like, well, this NPC wants you to do this very good thing that will screw up the timeline for your evil plot and will waste a lot of your power. Do you still do it? Well, we really like so-and-so, and they've helped us a bunch. It's like, are you really chaotic evil? And all of a sudden it becomes this fascinating kind of moral play of how dedicated are you to the cause, right? And that becomes really entertaining. And so the godly stuff can work on all sorts of levels of that, right? It sort of ties back to that thing we were saying about the faith, like, okay, I'm in for my God. Are you all the way? Let's see how deep that goes. The God of healing, you realize, isn't as selfless as you thought, or the God of war is not as evil as you once believed. The Lord of lies was telling truth all along, or, and all these amazing kinds of turns that people have. One of the things I think is really important is, it's almost like the rumor chart in the old adventures. Some of these rumors are true and some of them are not true, and some of them are in direct opposition to reality, and you need to parse that stuff out. But when the adventure starts, everyone knows so-and-so is the God of just and truth and all these things. And then you realize, no, at some point in their legend, they have betrayed others, or they have done evil things, or maybe they got there unjustly. Oh, do I still back this God? Am I still the paladin of this, concept? All kinds of fun things like that, where wherever you started and wherever it's going to go, figure out what the truth is behind those elements, and how you can, when you turn that card, narratively speaking.
Well, and asking that in the sense of like, I like the idea specifically of a God of justice, and like you were asking the question of like, but are they always just? Like, are they always fighting for justice? And the question that the mortals who could be your PCs will, or maybe the statement that will be said is, I could do it better. Well, and then we're playing in a campaign where there are new gods coming about, and you get to that, you get to lean in as a DM and say, could you? And you,
Yeah. Well, or this idea of if you are good and just and you want to be the god of this and you realize there's even a chance, well, now you have to embody that. So again, I have to test the concept. So if I put you in a situation where you might sacrifice yourself, you're like, well, I want to become a god. If I sacrifice myself, I won't get to be a god. But if you want to be the god of good and just and protection, guess you got to be willing to sacrifice yourself, take it all away. That's the fun stuff where you get to turn, so many stories come from asking those questions. So you look at what are the core traits of a character, and then how do I put the pressure on them to reinforce those qualities, right? So is Batman a loner? Well, he's got Robin. So is he a loner? Well, he's got Batgirl. Well, is he a loner? Well, he's got Nightwing. No, he's not at all. He actually is desperate to get a family around him. That's part of, as grim and dark as the Dark Knight is, he actually needs other people around him to balance that darkness and to try and pull him from going too deep into it. And so the way we find that out is by testing the concept, right? So, test those concepts in terms of your pantheon, test those concepts in terms of your players, and you'll find all kinds of story potential. And try not to prescribe the absolute endpoint. Like set up potential endings and set up, oh, I see where this could go. And then try not to railroad your players towards that absolute end, right? Because you're not writing a novel, because you are doing a collaborative, process.
Speaking of novels, that brings us around to, I am halfway decent at these segues, brings us around to one of my favorite points, and it is certainly homework of pieces of media that we can toss out for our listeners to read, watch, interact with. And, obviously I'll kick it off to bring it completely full circle. Were you Wayward? Yeah,
spoilers.
Surprise.
Yeah.
Okay. Comixology, go to your local comic store, get them to get you, because if memory serves, and it does, I think it's in 6 trade paperbacks.
Yeah. And 3 deluxe hardcovers.
There we go.
So each of the deluxe hardbacks has 2 of the softcover trades and some extra making of material in there too.
Yeah, so definitely that's on the list. The other one I would throw out is the supplement for the God's Fall world book, because it has a lot of deity pieces that I've personally used in a game. If you are really going down the road that most of your players, if not all of your players, are obtaining new godhood, it is certainly a great supplement to give, to just steal it wholesale, start using it, or find the pieces you really enjoy.
Yeah, I think what's really important is to, if you decide that you want to use a pre-established set, a pantheon, whatever, you're going to do the Forgotten Realms or Greyhawk or anything like that, don't be afraid to make changes to it. Don't be afraid to shake some of that stuff up, because what you don't want is to feel like it's trapped in the text of the supplement. Sometimes I think people feel published kind of paralyzation. They're like, well, if it's not written in an official book, they don't feel confident going outside the lines. Do you know what I mean? And it's like, no, this is a creative outlet. It's totally cool. The right way to use it is the one that your cast is entertained and that you were engaged and having fun with it.
That's come up a couple
when
times.
I was a kid,
on our show.
Yeah,
recently.
When I was a kid, I wanted everything to be like by the book, because if I did it by the book, then I was doing it right. And I'm doing hanging air quotes in our podcast here to say it right. But this idea that it's okay to change and mold and push things forward. That's where a lot of the fun comes from. It allows you to get more creative with the stuff.
It's your Forgotten
And if you're doing
Realms.
a homebrew campaign, all bets are off. Like, go make it cool and make it weird, and don't be afraid. And I think in some cases, as much as you said at the start that generally your players are not involved, I think there can be some really fun engagement if you're building a world, to build certain sections of it and then to leave some of it open to interpretation and ask your players what they're excited about. Do they think it would be cooler if, and you don't have to give them all the secrets right from the get-go, but just get a sense of where their motivation is. Like, do they want to do a big god war, or do they want to save the people that are being affected by the war? Or do they want to have, go right to the top and get a sense of where their engagement lies? And that will help to motivate and mobilize you as you're building this stuff as well, rather than just sort of putting it down and going, all right, you guys are fighting the god of dragons next week, you know, like, or whatever.
Yeah. I think for me, the one thing that came immediately to mind, honestly, while we were discussing the idea of new gods, old gods, is Neil Gaiman's American Gods. I think
Oh,
that's
big
a
time.
great source of inspiration, especially you're talking about different motivations,
Mhm.
different personalities, and like, yeah, it's a perfect place to go to think of that replacing the old.
Right. And also an understanding that, you know, as you have the shifting kind of, there's all sorts of ways you can play with the tie between mortals and gods, right? So one of the classic elements is, you know, gods are worshipped or need to be worshipped, right? So if a particular god, let's say during a major war or some apocalyptic event, which might be a precursor to all this stuff, let's say one of these kingdoms collapses from an earthquake, well, all of a sudden the center of worship falls apart. And because of that, the worship of that god is greatly diminished, and that god becomes weak for the first time in an age. And now the other gods go, oh, you're fresh meat
Yes.
now. Like, I thought, you know, you were unstoppable, but this chain of events has led to you. I see now the hole in your armor, and I'm going to strike. Do you know what I mean? And so what you can start an adventure off is there's an earthquake, and you're like, oh, this is all pretty straightforward. And because of that, this happens. And because of that, this happens. And all of a sudden that ripple effect becomes, oh, this is happening on multiple levels. There's the ground level, the literal ground level of people's lives are at stake. And then there's the higher level of the gods are at play and at war, you know? Yeah.
Well, our last and most important question is, Jim, where can people go on the proverbial interwebs to find all that you do? And if I'm going to take a shot, it's jimzub.com, in case you were wondering.
It is. Yeah. That's right. Jimzub.com is sort of the hub for everything. So interviews and previews and all kinds of stuff like that. I have a lot of tutorials about how to write, over 40 free articles on my main website. If you really want to do a deep dive, I do have a Patreon where I have over 250 comic scripts and pitches. So you can compare what I wrote with what was published and then see where those changes in the editorial process, changed and evolved the thing forward. And that you can access for the price of a fancy coffee. So it's been really great getting feedback from people and excitement as they get kind of a peek under the hood in terms of how the engine runs and all that sort of stuff. I've started to branch out. I was doing all these tutorials just via text, but I started to do videos recently. And so from my website, you'll see a lot of links to the YouTube page where I'm chatting about the story process. I'm interviewing other creators, talking to them about how they got their start, the stories that, influenced their writing styles, processes and techniques. And I've found it really enlightening. Like, I did it as really a lesson for other people. And every so often someone on one of those interviews says something either that I do, but I hadn't quite codified it that way, or something I don't do and I should be. And I'm like, oh, I like learning while I'm, teaching. This is cool.
And you have unlocked the reason we really do this podcast.
Right?
Absolutely.
Exactly. Right. Like, I love hearing about the process. I love hearing about, other people's creative ideas and the way that they engage that stuff, and seeing the similarities and seeing the differences. And not that I'm going to be able to incorporate everything, but recognizing which ones work well with how I work and which ones, I want to explore, and which other ones are like, I don't do it that way, but I'm glad it works for you, And the same thing's true of tabletop. Like, the fact that the games can be everything from a highly strategic kind of a miniature war simulation all the way through to, theater of the mind and high drama with barely a die rolled and everything in between. And that I can turn that dial sometimes session to session, that I feel like, oh, this is a really story centric one. We're never leaving town. We're just going to go to the ball tonight and do all that stuff. And then next session is like, man, it's a dungeon crawl and I'm trying to figure out my 5-foot step or whatever like that. I love that we can kind of throttle it and change it up and surprise people with different takes on the game itself, Yeah.
Jim, thanks so much for just coming back on. We hope to have you again Join us in the future. We love
Thanks.
talking to you, and I, for one, will say this has been a phenomenal conversation. So, again, thank you for joining us back on the Dungeon Masters Block.
Oh, my pleasure. Like I said, tabletop's at the heart of so much of what I do, and I love being able to throw kind of ideas out into the fray. When you first, you told me, oh, we're going to be talking about gods and stuff, I was like, okay, I just don't want it to be about, huge statistics, because I feel like that removes all the narrative and the agency to the whole thing.
Not on this podcast.
Man. It's a pleasure. Nice.
So thanks for joining us again on another episode of the Dungeon Masters Block. I hope that you all enjoyed this episode as much as I did being able to engage in the conversation. I hope you enjoyed being able to listen to our conversation, and that what is always our hope is that you are able to walk away from this episode with your brain just filled to the brim with inspiration for your next D&D game or your D&D homebrew world. If you like this episode, or you've liked past or future episodes of this show, please do us a favor, and on your podcatcher app of choice, leave us a 5-star review. Leave us a review. It helps us to get out there and for other DMs to hear us, and potentially new DMs to hear our show. You can follow us on Twitter at DMS_block. That's at DMs Block. And you can like our Facebook page. And as always, the Dungeon Masters Block is a proud member of the Block Party Podcast Network. Check out other shows like Geek Wars, We're So Bad at Adventuring, Dungeons and Dragons and Daughters, and more. And with that, that's all we have for you on this episode of the Dungeon Masters Block, the place where we come together to talk about the Dungeon Master, the most important person in the game, the only person capable of playing God, killing characters, and lowering the egos of all other people at the table. I'm DM Mitch, reminding you to always keep on dungeon mastering.